James Mattis quits as US Defense Secretary. His protest resignation coming after Donald Trump announced he's withdrawing troops from Syria. He's also said to be planning to pull US forces from Afghanistan. So with Mattis going, who will now try and control an unpredictable president? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. He was seen as a measure of calm and stability in a White House swirling with chaos and unpredictability. Now, James Mattis has resigned as US Secretary of Defense over serious foreign policy differences with Donald Trump. His departure comes as the president ordered a withdrawal of US forces from Syria and suggestions he'll pull thousands out of Afghanistan too. In his resignation letter, Mattis said he believes in treating allies with respect. Trump's announcement certainly took the US's friends by surprise and left many wondering if the US is a dependable ally. We have lots to talk about with our guests in a moment, but first, Mike Hanna has this report from Washington, D.C.
All I can say is he is the real deal. He is the real deal. Thank you.
President Trump initially surrounded himself with generals. James Mattis as Secretary of Defense, Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, followed by another general, H.R. McMaster, and of course John Kelly, who was moved from Homeland Security to take over as Chief of Staff. All are now gone or going. Mattis in particular seen as a central figure in keeping a largely dysfunctional White House partly functional.
Secretary Mattis was one of the few symbols, the few items of strength and stability in this administration. Everything that indicates stability, everything that indicates strength, everything that indicates knowledge is leaving this administration.
When President Trump criticized NATO and threatened to leave it, Mattis was the one reassuring allies behind the scenes. He helped push the president to moderate his position on the GCC crisis.
1, 2, 3.
And he was able to get the president to make an open-ended commitment in Afghanistan while loosening restrictions on US troops fighting there. And when Trump tweeted out that he was banning transgender service members, Mattis slow-rolled the order until courts put it on hold. The president's disenchantment was inevitably made public.
I think he's sort of a Democrat, if you want to know the truth.
It would appear the final straw for James Mattis was what many believe was a unilateral executive decision to withdraw US forces from Syria. The secretary's resignation letter coming less than 24 hours later, making clear the core difference in his belief in multilateralism and respect for allies and the president's lack of either. The letter continues, "Because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it's right for me to step down from my position." This departure is different from the many that have gone before, highlighting like no other the maverick nature of a president that critics insist increasingly spurns advice, even on the eve of a possible partial shutdown of government. One that announces the resignation of a respected, if not revered man who served his nation for decades in a tweet. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's bring in our guest. Joining us from Maryland on Skype is David DesRoches, Professor of Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University and former Director of NATO Operations at the Pentagon. From Kabul, Habib Wardak, founding member of Transparency Afghanistan and National Security Analyst. And from Dusseldorf, on Skype, Andreas Craig, Assistant Professor at the Defense Studies Department, King's College London, and a specialist on jihadist groups in the Middle East. Welcome to the program. I'd like to begin with you in Maryland, David DesRoches. We've heard a lot in the last 12 hours about the adults in the room and about James Mattis being the last adult to leave. And by that, they mean a tempering influence to some of the US president's more mercurial tendencies. Is that a fair way of describing the current situation?
Well, we're not sure. It's certainly a common way of describing the situation. The president is mercurial. The president is not a member of the Washington foreign policy establishment. He conducts himself as a businessman, where it's acceptable to throw out positions and see what the reaction is, even if you don't intend to take them. He insists on tweeting. He's incredibly undisciplined in his public messaging. And I think it's fair to say that he drives the bureaucracy crazy. But there are, other responsible people around him. They may not have the profile, stature, and the kind of base of support and respect around Washington that Mattis has. But there are still a lot of good people working in government in positions of authority.
David DesRoches, though, the letter that General Mattis sent was not only strong, but it was seemingly a rebuke of the way the president's going. Is the president likely to even listen to this, given his past behavior?
The president takes some advice, but I think he has a belief, which his election bore out at least once, that he has his finger on the pulse of America better than the people like me who live within the Washington Beltway have.
Andreas Craig in Dusseldorf. The letter that General Mattis sent was very strong, and it said that the allies were absolutely key. It seems that this White House doesn't really place much faith in its allies, preferring to go its own way. Would that be a correct characterization, do you think?
Yes and no. I mean, it's so difficult to put a label on the Trump administration because a lot of the things, as David already pointed out, a lot of it is kind of complex and in many ways also somewhat difficult to put in a box. Because, the Trump White House has said, their big motto is America first, and that has been translated in many ways a withdrawal from multilateral agreements. It means, a potential he for many, many months was basically putting a question mark behind the U.S.'s integrity in NATO. He was basically saying, we want to withdraw from most of the multilateral commitments that we have around the world if they don't serve our interests directly. However, he's made some U-turns wherever see fit. And I think Mattis was a very important character in ensuring that some of these U-turns that the Trump administration has made, which were very important, particularly on NATO, were his product and were a product of his counsel. Now, with him gone, we have a lot of hawkish people in very prestigious, high-profile positions. And many of these hawkish individuals might push him to take more hawkish, more outlandish, from a policy establishment point of view, more outlandish decision when it comes to particularly the region of the Middle East, over which I think Mattis very much withdrew. So, I mean, this Trump administration is one that doesn't necessarily believe in multilateralism, only if it really serves their national interests. And the way they have failed to somewhat understand that national interests can be very well served by strong partnerships, has somewhat led to this isolationist view that many have tried to put on the Trump administration. But it's kind of difficult to put him into that box because, as I said, he kind of U-turned a couple of times.
David DesRoches in Maryland. Andreas Craig makes a very interesting point there. Whoever comes in next as Secretary of Defense may well be more hawkish on issues like Iran, sanctions on Iran, et cetera, and that may well push the president into a further extreme position. What's the president looking for in his next Secretary of Defense? Will it be somebody like that?
Well, he's got enough hawkish. Issues of sanctions are determined primarily by Treasury and State, and he's pretty much comfortable with the guys he has there, and of course, John Bolton. I think, honestly, the next Secretary of Defense is going to focus more on the internal nuts and bolts of running the Department of Defense and rebuilding the Department of Defense that, from the perspective of Trump and his supporters, has been run down in 17 years of fighting, insurgencies in the Middle East that don't really directly affect American interests at this moment, and instead rebuild the capacity to confront near-peer competitors, like if Russia tries to assault the Baltics or if China tries to take Taiwan again. I think he's going to look at that sort of thing. And when you look at his appointments, the elevation of General Mark Milley from Army Chief of Staff to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, his message has been rebuilding the Army for massive conventional warfare. The Secretary of the Army, Mark Esper, who is a classmate of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, his focus has been on emphasizing rebuilding the Army for conventional war. And I think we'll see something like that. So I think we'll see more of a technocrat rather than an ideologue.
Let's get the view from Kabul here, clearly a very key US ally. You've heard there from David DesRoches, there's been this 17-year-long war against insurgents within Afghanistan itself, the American public seemingly fed up of that. What does this potential withdrawal of 7,000 troops, 7,000 US troops from Afghanistan mean for the Kabul government?
Well, I think more than any day else, today Afghans are thinking of the 90s, the civil war. The Afghans look at this 7,000 troops withdrawal as a premature withdrawal. We believe that we have had 14,000 plus troops on the ground, and you still have had a lot of casualties inflicted to the Afghan National Army. We have had provinces and districts lost to the Taliban. And when you withdraw 7,000 from the 14,000 you had, I don't think this conveys a very positive image. And the reason we call it a premature withdrawal is because we are yet to strike a deal with the Taliban. This will give a strong moral to the Taliban. The Taliban believe they have the time on their part. Where the Americans are now fed up of the 17 years of war. It did not bear any results for them. On the other side, you have the Afghan government, which serves as the local partner for the international community, which is led by the United States. The questions about its competence, its capabilities are yet to be answered. There's still a lot of corruption. There's still division as of coming up with a united front as to deal with Taliban in terms of peace, as of what does this peace would mean in terms of the governance, the future of Afghanistan. There's a panic mode. Everybody is in panic mode when they woke up to the news this morning. The future seems very uncertain at the moment. We don't know whether it'll be 7,000, what happens to the assist, train, and advise program of the Afghan National Forces by the US-led coalition. These are all the questions that the time will answer. For now, everybody is in a panic mode.
There are several questions to be answered. Clearly, the policy will unfold in the coming weeks. But Habib Wardak, I just want to follow up with you. It's interesting that you mentioned the civil war in the 90s there. That civil war took place because there was a power vacuum which allowed the Afghan Taliban to take over simply because there was no one to stop them. Are you worried that you'll see that kind of situation again if the US fully withdraws?
Absolutely, yes. Given that if we could not get to reach a peace deal before the US withdrawal, I could understand that it's very likely. You have Taliban that are stronger than any time else in the past 17 years. They have beyond 40% of the territory that they control or either contest. And you have a weak government which has its own internal problems. We are supposed to go into elections in the next 6 months, but we have had parliamentary elections 2 months ago, which had its own crisis. And there's a lot of internal division in Kabul amongst the political elites that we have in Kabul. The picture does not look very, very neat and clean. Given that you have the US withdrawal, I think Taliban will start advancing towards Kabul. Yes, we do have the Afghan National Security Forces. They have paid a heavy price over the past years, in specific to the past 3 to 4 to 5 years. Given that the Americans will withdraw, you will have lack of air support, and they will face all sorts of problems, which does not sound good for the Afghan government, for the general Afghan public. It's not altogether very comfortable feeling.
Andreas Craig, I want to bring you in here from Dusseldorf. Withdrawing the troops, you're a military expert, you work at the War Studies Department at King's College London. Tactically, militarily, is this a sensible thing to do, particularly when dealing with a group like the Afghan Taliban?
Well, I mean, this comes in the context of what the Trump administration announced in Syria as well. So my point in Syria is that from an operational point of view, it won't make a huge difference, considering that the Americans have already, since Obama and Trump, in many ways has continued that, is have invested into surrogate warfare, which I call surrogate warfare. It's a war by delegation, whereby the Americans have a relatively small contingent with boots on the ground, which then use massive force multipliers with local forces. So these kind of operations are interesting to a degree, because then they allow the Americans to stay on the ground, to create a context which will not lead to victory necessarily, but at least keep a balance whereby the Americans still have a say. Strategically, however, these both decisions in Syria and Afghanistan are highly problematic, because it sends a signal to allies and opponents across the region, and I include Afghanistan in the region here, that America no longer is interested to basically bear the burden of war and bear the burden of conflict in that region, as they might have done 60 or 70 years. And by withdrawing, especially in Syria now, you're sending also the signal to your allies, and in Afghanistan to the Afghan National Forces, you're sending a signal that we're actually no longer necessarily supporting you at the level that we promised, and then kind of exposing them to the risk of the insurgent. At this time in Syria, it might be ISIS, and the other in Afghanistan, it might be ISIS and Taliban. You're basically allowing them to be exposed to that huge risk without sufficient air support, sufficient boots and trainers and directors on the ground. So surrogate warfare is already problematic as it is, but at least it allows the Americans to do a little bit. By withdrawing, you're also sending a signal in Syria to Iran, to Russia, and to Turkey, who are the real big players, that America is no longer interested in being a player in post-conflict Syria. And I think stabilization in both these conflicts, in Syria and in Afghanistan, means you need long-term commitments in order to oversee the stabilization process. By withdrawing, the West now completely loses any way in of determining how stabilization in the future will look like, and in many ways allows the insurgent to regain that ground and fill the gap that is, or the void that was left.
I'm going to follow up with you, Andreas Craig. David DesRoches in Maryland said that the next Secretary of Defense may well be about the nuts and bolts of this, possibly more secretary than defense. Do you think that's the way the Defense Department in the US should be going, given the threats and challenges it faces?
Yes, I mean, overall, I think if we look at the hybridity of the challenges that the US and the West in general is up against, I think defense has to be written with a small d, which means military is just one of the levers of power that should be concentrated upon, and the new Secretary of State will have to make sure that all these different levers of power in the defense realm, particularly when we talk about information warfare and cyber and so on, that these also are included. And I think a robust and too much of a focus on conventional military operations near peer, as David said, this is something I think is kind of missing the mark. However, I think if you look at the line of people that were up in discussion over the last couple of days in Washington of who could succeed General Mattis, all of these people would share Mattis's point of view of saying, well, the strategy is problematic in Afghanistan and Syria, but if in the end of the day we want some sort of a political outcome, and somewhat of a political outcome that is robust and sustainable, then we also need to keep a bit of the pressure on at least. And withdrawing means we're withdrawing our operational military assets, but also our potential diplomatic and strategic assets by bringing people around the table to discuss. So that is the problem. I don't think anybody in the Defense Department right now will, or whoever will succeed, will say that's actually a good idea, because we do need the military lever in these two conflicts in order to facilitate a diplomatic solution.
David DesRoches, let's just talk about domestic politics here. How much of this is the US President Donald Trump fulfilling a campaign promise? How much of this is actually just politicking? He said he was going to get the Americans out of unpopular and unwinnable wars.
Yeah, boy, that's a really good question, and I think you put your finger right on it. One thing that's really important to this president is that he wants to be able to go to the American people and say, look, I told you I'd do something, I did it. And particularly at the Syria decision, if you looked at it, people forget, but a year ago to the day, the Saudis and our other security partners in the Gulf said, hey, we don't want the United States to leave Syria. It's important to confront Iran there. the president said, all right, we'll stay, but I'm going to revisit this position in a year. And I believe it was within a day of a year or close to that. So when the president says something, he means it. And he is good at gauging public opinion, particularly outside of, the bubble I live in. Places like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, where it was felt he didn't have a chance, traditional Democratic strongholds. These guys are saying, what has 17 years of war in Afghanistan gotten us? When I deployed to Afghanistan in 2002, my son was 6 months old and I had a beautiful mane of hair. And now my son's got a beard and you have what you see before you.
In Kabul, Habib Wardak, I want to come to you. Is it time for the Afghans to look for another more reliable ally than the US government? Is it time to start to look to India, for example, Pakistan, China?
It's a very difficult question. With the Afghan government, Afghanistan at large does not enjoy a very healthy relationship with Pakistan, and India is quite far off. I think it's very important for the Afghan government and for the Afghans to focus on fixing the Afghan problem inside Afghanistan. It's much more important than going and looking for yourself an ally in the region. One thing is for sure that nobody could replace the United States. In terms of the financial aid that is given to the Afghan government, the international credibility that has been given to the Afghan government, and the military aid. It is very important for the Afghans to focus on solving the problem inside Afghanistan. But the $1 million question will be, are the Taliban willing to talk to the Afghan government? Because Taliban's stand is very hawkish in terms of that they would want to talk to the Americans and not the Afghan government, believing that the Afghan government is a puppet regime. It's the Americans who toppled their regime, so that the Americans are acting as an invader force in Afghanistan, and they'll talk to the Americans alone. And Taliban being a non-state actor, and going to a negotiating table and talking to the Americans about the future of Afghanistan in terms of peace, in terms of the future government, I think they're already winning on political front as well. They have been fighting quite hard over the past 17 years and advancing quite rapidly, especially over the past 4 to 5 years, meaning winning militarily. And now they're scoring politically as well. It is not a good sign for the Afghan government and for the Afghan people at large. To reiterate my point, I think it's very important to focus on how we can reach to a peace deal inside Afghanistan. India cannot come and replace the United States. China, it'll be difficult for China to come and replace the United States. And in other words, we just got to fix our own problem.
We are running out of time, but I do want to end with you, David Roches, there in Maryland. You've heard what Habib Wardak in Kabul had to say, that it is time for the Afghans to step up and solve their own problems. Almost this will be seen as a victory for President Donald Trump if that happens, but it's unlikely to happen, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, the problem with the Afghan government has been the same problem since 2003. And, the problem is, just what Habib said, corruption, inefficiency, all these institutions of the Afghan government, in spite of millions of dollars. There's a lot of SUVs and restaurants in Kabul. The population of Kabul is tripled since I was there. But what has it done outside of the area that the international forces secure? And it's a real tragedy for the Afghan National Security Forces that they've been fighting and dying for a government that's still not very good. So if the Afghans were to solve it, I think it would be a lot easier for America to continue to support it. But, the litany, and senior officials of both parties have said, and military officers like General Dan Bolger have just said, hey, man, it's just time to go. We've lost. We only haven't admitted it. I think it's also fair to say that the Obama deadline to leave, that is initially what really emboldened and revived the Taliban movement, because that just said, hey, man, all we got to do is, hide out, and eventually these guys are going to go away.
I want to thank you all. Sadly, we are out of time on an issue that is going to go on for a very long time. Thank you, David DesRoches, Habib Wardak, and Andreas Craig. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.